Katherine Martinko is a digital wellness writer, editor, and speaker. She's the author of Childhood Unplugged, Practical Advice to Get Kids Off Screens and Find Balance, and creator of a fast-growing Substack newsletter called The Analog Family. Katherine speaks publicly on behalf of Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation campaign and appears regularly on national radio, TV, talk shows, and podcasts. She has written over 4,000 news articles for leading newspapers and for brands like Martha Stewart, Discovery, Huffington Post, and Motherly. Hi, Katherine. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So I'm so excited to talk to you about the subject of digital minimalism. And this is something where you have described yourself as a digital minimalist, which is a term I love and I use as well for myself. So I'd love for you to tell people, what does it mean and how can parents disconnect in our hyper-connected digital age?
Sure. So I sadly cannot take credit for the term. It does come from Cal Newport, who is a computer science professor at Georgetown University and also a prolific author. He wrote a book called Digital Minimalism. I believe it came out in 2019. But it was a book that was a huge bestseller, and it obviously had a very big impression on me when I read it, and has very much inspired my whole philosophy. So he defines it as a philosophy of technology usage in which you focus your online time on a small number of selected and optimized activities that strongly support the things you value, and then you happily miss out on all of the rest. So when I first read this, it spoke to me because I knew that I was uncomfortable with the way that technology has taken over so many aspects of our lives, but I didn't want to get rid of it completely. I didn't want to become a Luddite and just return to a way of living where we didn't have the benefits of these digital devices. And so I think that it sort of gave me permission to choose what worked for me and then to reject what did not work for me. And so it was a way to recognize technology as a powerful tool, something that we need to learn to use with respect and with care, but also not let it become just the primary source of entertainment in our lives. So it's a philosophy that really advocates for balance, and I think that is a good approach for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing the way I think of it is like it's like a curation, right? Like you're just curating and picking the things that work best for you, work best for your family, as opposed to kind of taking it all or letting the tech take over, right? In that way, it kind of puts the control back into your hands, is the way I think about it. I don't know if that's the way you think about it too.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. I think that not all the tools and not all the platforms are created equally. So you can't just paint them all with the same brush and,
Yeah.
throw them out completely. My iPhone is very powerful and very useful for certain things. It can be it can be more of a negative force for other things. So same with, a laptop versus a computer. So for instance, my kids, they don't have smartphones. My oldest is 15, he's in 10th grade.
Mhm.
The others are 13 and 9, and that sometimes shocks people. But I don't limit their access to technology completely. The oldest does have a laptop that's issued by his school.
Right.
He has an email address. He can join group chats and still communicate with his friends, but it's on a computer, which to me creates a little bit of friction, makes it a little bit harder for him to look at his messages and his emails and whatever videos he might be looking at online, than it would be if he had it in his pocket on a smartphone, just accessible every minute of the day.
For sure. I mean, it sets a mindfulness about it, right? Maybe a little bit more the way we grew up, where if we were going online, we were sitting in front of a computer in a designated place, right? And not, like you said, having the supercomputer in your pocket 24 hours a day. There's a huge difference there. And I think that sets a nice boundary. So that's really interesting. Okay, so I want to ask you about this idea of authoritative parenting, which is something that I actually just recently learned about. I read this book, Raising Resilience. I don't know if you've heard of that, by Dr. Tova P. Klein. I interviewed her here as well. And she talks a lot about this approach. So this is what you say is the approach you use as well. So would you mind explaining it and how this relates to digital parenting as well?
Sure. I'm not quite sure where I first came across the term. It's definitely been a few years. I believe it was researched by Diana Baumrind a number of decades ago. So I think it's been around for a while, where she sort of divided parenting into four main categories. There's the authoritative, the authoritarian, the neglectful, and then the permissive. Parents can sort of roughly be grouped into these four different categories. And authoritative parents are generally defined as parents who are very nurturing, very supportive, very loving of their children, but they do set very clear boundaries and rules for their children, and they do have clear expectations of their children. Authoritative parents will listen to their child's viewpoint, but they don't necessarily accept it. And I think that this is sort of key. When it comes to technology, I am of the belief that we as parents have a responsibility to draw quite firm boundaries with dealing with technology. Kids are not capable of managing it themselves. They are just too susceptible to its addictive and compulsive properties, and we have to create those rules. Now, those rules are not going to be popular with our kids. We know how hard it is, even as parents, to put these devices down, how tantalizing they are. So just imagine it for a child who doesn't even have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. Everything is at their fingertips. It's absolutely irresistible. So we have to create those rules. Our children might behave like they hate us. They might tell us that we are ruining their lives. I've certainly heard that one before. But as an authoritative parent, we recognize that this is what we need to do for the child's own benefit. And that someday, hopefully, they'll look back and they'll be appreciative of it. But it's not popular. It can kind of feel like a tough row to hoe in a way sometimes when you're a parent, to kind of go against the status quo and against what other more permissive parents might be doing with their children. But I see it as ultimately just being hopefully the wisest route to take with children.
Yeah, I think one of the points that you brought up is this idea that being authoritative, there is an element of democracy to it, right? Like you mentioned, okay, we listen to our kids, right? But ultimately we make the call. And I think that's really interesting because I've spoken to a lot of experts about this idea of tech. And even when you set boundaries, they do need to be fluid, right? Your kid's going to grow, technology is going to change, things like that. But what's nice about this approach is, yes, we can listen to our kids, and maybe we say, okay, here's the rules now. If you make a strong case, maybe we can have that conversation, right? But at the end of the day, knowing that you're going to make that final call, I think is something that not only your kids want, but is necessary as part of this process. I don't know if you've thought about that, the democracy of it and the fluidity of that. But I do think that this style makes a lot of sense for digital parenting for those reasons. I don't know.
Yeah. The fluidity, I mean, I would say my screen time rules in the home are constantly evolving based on new things that I learn. If
Yeah.
anything, they might get stricter over time, which is kind of funny, I guess. But there's so much more evidence, there's so much more research to show the negative aspects of it. So I will sometimes tighten rules up. But it's always open for discussion. I always welcome those conversations with my children. I will explain where I'm coming from. I often offer these conversation starters in my talks that I give about things you can say to your kid to kind of, preempt the really difficult conversations, just to say, this is how we do things in our family, or our family is different than other families, or you're
Yeah.
welcome to do things differently when you have your own family someday. They really hate that one, but, they can't
Yeah.
really argue with it. And yeah, I think sometimes things evolve. I'm trying to think of an example of that. For instance, I guess they didn't have group chats for a really long time because they didn't have smartphones. But then we found this workaround where they could use iMessage on our desktop computer in a common area of the home, which
Mhm.
allowed them to be able to join these group chats with their friends. So they still get their fair share of silly memes and,
Yeah.
videos and different things that their friends send, which they felt they were missing out on. And I didn't want them to feel that sense of exclusion. So that was a good workaround where they can still do that, but I don't have to worry about them walking around with a smartphone in their pocket.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the most key things you just said is tweaking based on new things you learn. This is something I come across a lot in the parent
Mm-hmm.
eds where I think parents feel helpless if they've already
Mm-hmm.
given something, right? They've given the smartphone, they've given the access to the game or whatever. And then, they've changed their mind. And I tell them, I don't know if you agree with this, but that it's okay to change your mind as a parent. It's okay to say, I made a mistake. And it's also really amazing to be able to come to them with, hey, I went to a parent talk and I learned something. Wow, I didn't know that before. Or, ooh, this new study came out. I didn't know that before. Like, I want to share it with you. And this is why I'm changing the rules. So there's actually a lot of tools out there. And I actually think it's okay to model to kids like, hey, we make mistakes too. And this is brand new technology. We're all learning. So that's one of the things that came up when you talked about like still learning and evolving.
Yeah,
But
no, I'm nodding here enthusiastically because I agree with you completely. That is
yeah,
such a common theme. It comes up in talks all the time. Parents who come to me, sometimes quite emotionally, who say, I feel like it's too late. There's nothing I can do. I've lost my child. I don't know how to rein it back in. And I maintain that it is never too late to change your mind. There is so much more evidence too, and you can arm yourself with that evidence. You can educate yourself and you can go to your child. And that's where the authoritative parenting aspect comes back in, really, because your child doesn't have to agree with you. You know, you can lay out some new baseline rules, some new household rules for how technology is going to be used in a way that your kid might just have to adjust to. It might not be popular initially, but you can do it if you know it's the best thing. And, you know, you don't want to, I mean, part of just being human is constantly evolving. You know, you don't want to stagnate. We're always changing our minds based on new information. And that's how we should be, I think, in relationships, you know, philosophically, politically. Like, we're always learning, we're always growing, we're always challenging our ways of thinking. And so I think when it comes to technology, it's very similar. You can revisit those rules for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it also just models like growth mindset too, I think, you know, teaching kids to constantly learn and evolve and adapt. So
And
win-win.
one
Yeah.
thing I would add too is I urge parents not to feel bad about how they may have handled technology in the past, because
Yeah.
it's easy to sort of beat yourself up over having given your 10-year-old a smartphone and then maybe regretting it a number of years down the line, you know, fearing what you may have done. But,
Yeah.
you know, you didn't know the things then that you know
Right.
now. And so really the key is, what can you do now based on what you know?
Exactly. Totally. Okay. So I feel like we set ourselves up for this with what we were just talking about, but I want to talk to you about parental stress.
Mm.
And so let's start with the Surgeon General's advisory, which was pretty recent, August of 2024. So this is the US Surgeon General stated that parental stress is a significant public health issue. And a few statistics here. I believe this might have been from one of your articles, actually. Mothers spend 40% more time with their kids than they did in 1985. Fathers spend 154% more. And so we know this extra effort is hard on parents, but is it also good for kids? Is my question to you.
So that, yeah, that comes from an article I wrote for Jonathan Haidt's
Yeah.
After Babel blog, and I believe it was called "Parents, It's Okay to Do Less."
Yep.
So the answer to the question is no, it's not good for kids to have parents hovering over them every minute of the day. This is sort of a new phenomenon. We've become much more helicopterish in our approach to our kids just in the past, I don't know, 10, 15, maybe 20 years or so. And it's proving not to be benefiting the kids that much. Our children are so used to outsourcing all of their decision making to their parents that as soon as they're left on their own, they don't really know what to do. I think that digital media has facilitated this often because the parents can now keep tabs on their kids all the time. The kids don't have to develop any independent skills because they can call or text their parent. The parents are tracking the kids all the time. They always know where they are. And so it's sort of an unhealthy codependence in a way that I think we need to try to move ourselves away from. Now, it is normal to want to keep tabs on your kid and to make sure that they're safe, but we don't want to get in the way of our kids' natural, well, individuation, I guess, is one term that I've heard used, where the kid actually develops a self apart from the parent and learns new skills. I think the safest child is really the one who can navigate the world on their
Yeah.
own, that can get from point A to point B without relying on a phone. A lot of things can happen to a phone. You know, they could drop it in a puddle, it could break, it could get stolen. And if your kid doesn't actually know how to operate in the world
Yeah.
without that device, they could potentially be at greater risk. So I think that parents need to sort of recalibrate their conception of safety. They need to just, and the parent's job will actually become less stressful as a result. So the more life skills you give your child, the less you have to do for them. And that can be hard. You have to actually put in effort to train the child to, you know, I do this with my own boys. It can be hard sometimes. We've had all kinds of snow days. I think we've had 22 snow days to date because we've had just the most brutal winter ever here in Ontario in Canada. But my oldest son was sitting around the house without much to do, and I realized, you know, instead of me stressing out about what we are going to make for dinner, I should really just be passing off that duty to him. And so I
Mhm.
gave him, you know, a grocery list and a few recipes and sent him off to do the cooking that day and things like that. You know, it involved relinquishing control on my part, but it was a valuable lesson for him. And since then, he's actually been doing a lot more cooking, and my life has become less stressful as a result. So if we can sort of just transfer more independence onto the kids, more real life skills, our own stress load, I believe, will decrease.
Yeah, I've talked about this issue in different ways with different experts, and they all kind of agree it's anxiety for both, right? When we talk
Hmm.
about surveillance parenting, like you feel like you're in control, but really it's actually more stressful keeping tabs, wondering where they are, tracking them, like all the effort of that. And then of course it's anxiety inducing for the kids too. You described like not being able to figure things out on their own, or, just kind of worried that they might make mistakes. Mistakes are part of childhood, right? And learning and everything else. So what I hear over and over again from experts is the anxiety works both ways, with this
Hmm.
older parenting that we're talking about, this excessive time, the excessive monitoring, where we've lost this ability to just kind of leave kids to their own devices. And like you said, empower them, to do something that you might not think they can do. But with the example of your son cooking, like that's a huge life skill, right? To have to figure that out on his own and, take responsibility for that. And kids feel good, when
They
they get that
do.
responsibility. So
Yeah, it's a confidence booster. And I think too that we need to give kids things to be proud of. I talk about this
yes,
also in my work, how these are real physical products in a physical world. They're things that give kids incentives to get off of their phones because they're creating things, they're adding value to their world, to their families' lives. So even just, getting kids to do chores, I often encourage parents to do more
yeah,
of that. You have to sort of fill that time that you're pulling off of the devices and assigning housework and cooking, laundry, shoveling snow for us here. These sorts of tasks can really go a long way toward making a kid feel like they're valued contributors to a household.
for sure. I'll give one little story. My son's 12 now, but when he was 11, so we just got him an Apple Watch now. Before he had really no access. We didn't even do the computer or anything. But like really started to feel the effects of being left out of, the texting and the group chats, things like that. So he has talk and text now. But before he had talk and text, so him and I, one of our things is we go to the grocery store and, we'll cook things like that together. And one time I forgot ice and I thought, you know what? I'm going to let him go back by himself and get the ice. This is something that we wouldn't even thought about 10, 20 years ago as
Mm-hmm.
parents, but now we really think about these things. And I said to him, I'm gonna pull up, you're gonna go in, you're gonna get the ice, ask for help, here's my credit card, figure it out. And he said, okay. He went and did it, came out. He had the biggest smile on his face that I've ever seen. He's probably going to hate that I'm telling the story, but it almost was heartbreaking because it was such a small thing. But it was so important to him to have just like a little bit of independence, and he didn't have a phone to call me. He would, he just had to figure that out, but he felt so good having that independence and also just, like you said, the confidence of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's little things, like it's things like that, like that you wouldn't think would affect a kid, but it was huge for him. So I don't know. I guess like you, I would just encourage parents to think about it that way, whether it's a chore or something maybe that's uncomfortable for you. Let them do it, and it'll be huge for their confidence and their development. So it made me think of that story.
Yeah, no, I have a similar one actually that just took place a few weeks ago. I guess it was in the fall. My youngest son, he's 9. He really, really wanted to buy Beyblades, which you may know, they're these little spinny
Yes.
toy that are very popular right now.
Yep.
And I could not, we had to go to Walmart. It was where they had them nearest, and I didn't have time to go. And so he came to me, said, I'd like to ride my bike there. And it's about, I'd say it's like 2 miles, maybe a little mile and a half, trying to convert from kilometers to miles for American listeners. And I said, no way, you cannot bike that far on your own. And he said, but I know I can do it. And I really, really want to. And it took a moment of me just realizing he can do this. I just didn't really want him to do it because it scared me, but he
Yeah.
really wanted to do it. Needless to say, he did it. He biked to Walmart. He bought the Beyblades himself. And he came home and he was more excited about the independent outing than he was about the new toy. Just
Yeah.
totally overjoyed. And I think, again, we need to be responsive. When the kid wants the independence, we have to grant it to them if it's within reason, of course. Like we have to
Yeah.
gauge that it's not going to actually harm them. But kids often know deep down what they are capable of, and
Yeah.
parents tend to second guess it. And we have to believe in their capability because that's how they grow. That's how they become these resilient adults who are not ridden with anxiety because they really believe in their own ability to accomplish things.
Yeah, for sure. I love that story. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about parenting today because we've alluded to that a little bit versus parenting maybe in the previous generation. So 2/3 of parents are saying that parenting is harder today than it was 20 years ago. Many are citing technologies like social media and smartphones as a reason. So, in your opinion, is it really harder to be a parent today? And how does tech use factor into this equation?
Good question. I guess I can only really gauge my own experience. I do have a 15-year-old, but um, I don't know. I think it is harder. I think we have this whole kind of dark world to open to our children on the internet, which, I mean, there have always been sort of, dangerous, darker things that our kids could get into. But in the real world, these things are very vigorously age gated. Our kids can't
Yeah.
really do as many dangerous things. They can't go skydiving. They can't get tattoos. They can't drive cars. They can't buy alcohol, cigarettes, drugs. They can't, go into a casino or a strip club. Like we count on our society in real life, in real time, to prevent children from doing those things. In addition to our own rules as a family, the internet makes all of those things available to our kids. And that's really ramped up in the last, 10, 15, 20 years. So now our children can do all of those things because we don't have age gating. Everything is wide open. So I would say that the internet makes parenting terrifying and that we probably should be a lot more scared about what our kids can do online.
Yeah.
And there's a great line from Jonathan Haidt's book where he says kids are underprotected online and overprotected in the real world, how we've got it the wrong way around right now. So really what we need to do is flip that. The real world has never been a safer place to be a kid than it is right now. And so we as parents definitely need to, um, readjust that in our minds and realize that it's okay to send your kids out. It's okay to send them to buy ice at the store, buy Beyblades at Walmart. They're going to be just fine. But if we leave them in their rooms, in, anonymous chat rooms, looking on Snapchat, TikTok, just they're seeing a lot more stuff there than we probably realize as parents, and it's quite disturbing. So we have every parent, of course, faces its challenges. Every parent thinks that their generation is dealing with the hardest things. I get that. So who knows what's going to come after this? But we do have our work cut out for us as parents right now, and I think that that's why we do need to draw on those authoritative boundaries to sort of protect our kids from some of the temptations of the internet.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, every generation has its challenges, right? Like, I can't imagine raising a kid in the Depression era, for example.
Mhm.
How can we compare, right? This is just sort of the issue of our time. But what I will say, and what I firmly believe is harder, is just the workload. It's just more
Mm.
to manage. Like, we're dealing with things that every other parent probably has dealt with in previous generations. And then now we have this whole giant set of things to manage on top, right? And figure out how we're going to parent digitally, keep them safe, make sure their mental health is intact. Like, I would say for sure, workload wise, it has to be harder. I don't know, but that's definitely one thing that I think is pretty objective in this conversation.
Yeah, I do think we overschedule. We do have a tendency
Yeah.
to fill our kids' lives and even our own lives with all kinds of extracurricular activities and social obligations that I don't remember my parents doing nearly as much, and certainly my
No.
grandparents didn't. So that's part of the gist of that article I wrote for Jonathan Haidt's platform as well. It's parents, it's okay to do less. Sometimes descheduling can make everything feel a lot easier because you're not so exhausted by it all.
What's funny about overscheduling, and I don't know if you've heard this too. I've heard this from so many parents. Like, I keep them busy with X, Y, and Z to keep them off the screens. Have you ever heard people say that?
I have. Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
think that that's a common theme, and I don't think that that's a bad thing necessarily,
Yeah.
especially if you are in the active process of getting your kids like sort of what's it called? There's the replacement phase. So if your kids are used to having most of their time spent on devices, you are going to need to fill that time with other activities in order to make it less painful, right? There is sort of a withdrawal that occurs, and signing them up for organized activities can be a great way to push through that. However, it may not be how you want to continue living because that can be exhausting. And there's a lot of value in just having quiet downtime, in having mealtime together as a family, sitting down to eat, having time to get homework done, getting to bed at a good time.
Yeah.
Just creating time and space for spontaneous conversations and hangouts with family and friends. All of
Yeah.
it's very valuable.
And I would just add, this goes back to your article too, but if you condition them for doing less, right? If you condition them for boredom, for quiet moments, things like that, you won't feel like you have to overschedule them to keep them off screens, right? So if you combine conditioning them to do less with digital minimalism, I think you have a formula for letting them figure out what to do on their own, kind of going back to that resilience a little bit that we were talking about before. So it's like an interesting paradox, but actually doing less will benefit you in the long run, right? And I tell this to parents all
Mhm.
the time, like if you do the work to condition your kids for boredom early on, right? Like don't do the iPad in the restaurant, right? Like
Mhm.
that'll be maybe hard in moments, but it will pay dividends later. And I feel like that reminds me of what you're talking about now. Like if you condition them for quieter moments, for less, you won't feel like you have to fill their schedule, right? To keep them off their screens. So it's complicated in a way, but it's also simple in a way, doing less simplifies things for everyone. So
Yeah, no, I agree. Kids are marvelously adaptable too. So if you
yeah.
haven't established it from a young age, you can certainly introduce it at a later age, but it's always easiest to begin as you mean to go on. That's kind of a theme in my own book, Childhood Unplugged, where I talk about don't introduce the tech. If you haven't yet, try to avoid it because it's always harder to claw it back later after it's entered the child's life. But certainly you can normalize boredom.
Okay, cool. So I was going to ask you a little bit more about doing less. So I know we've covered it a little bit already, but let's talk about that recent article again, just a little bit more. So you mentioned Tom Hodgkinson. And that's the one where you said he advocates for parents doing less to raise happier kids. So we've covered this a little bit already. So we've also covered pro boredom a little bit. So he talks about a pro boredom philosophy. There's other phrases to describe this philosophy. So benign neglect, lifeguard parenting, free range parenting, mindful underparenting. I've also heard recently good enough mothering. I don't know if you've heard that
Mm.
one. So again, I feel like we've covered this a little bit, but if I had to ask you and if you had to elaborate, so why do you think parenting less is the best thing we can do for our kids?
I think it speaks to that stress load that you mentioned before.
Yeah.
So parents are just trying to do such a good job, and it's well intentioned. Don't get me wrong. You really do want to pour everything you've got into these children who are you just love them so much. Um, but you're going to just burn yourself out. You are going to definitely be an obstacle to your child's opportunities to become more independent. I just think that you have potential to improve your quality of life by just giving yourself a break, giving yourself a little bit more grace, and then also in the process giving the child a chance to find themselves, and to develop these new skills. So right now I just see parents who are burnt out, they're completely frazzled, they're at their wits' end. And, I feel like the Surgeon General's report, I took issue with the fact that its solutions involved, look for mental health support, try to build out your community, do these other things. And I felt like, or just do less, it's a
Yeah.
very easy solution that you can start with,
Yeah.
try to do less if you can. I understand that there can be some obstacles to that, but certainly it can improve your life if you deschedule.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a less stressed parent is a less stressed kid, right? Like, really simply, they do thrive on our energy. I mean, I don't think parents think about that, but when they're little, for sure. But even through, you have teenagers, like, even all the way through the teen years, I think kids do pick up on our energy.
Mhm.
So even if you just look at it very simply in that way, if you're less stressed out, I think that'll be less stress for your kids too, for sure.
Mhm.
Okay, so you mentioned Jonathan Haidt. So I want to ask you about another thing he talks about in The Anxious Generation, which is this idea of anti-fragility. So and basically, we talked about this a little bit, but this is how kids become more capable through facing challenges. You gave your example of, your son writing to the wall mark, and these are small challenges, right? But even these help with anti-fragility. So some of this comes from childhood independence, which we've covered already. This has been on a steep decline since the 1980s. So if you had to elaborate on this, we've touched on it. Why is childhood independence good for kids? Why should parents give more of it?
Um, Definitely, I feel like we've touched on this, but it's
Yeah.
a way for kids to build out these skills. So there's just a fantastic list of things that an 18-year-old should be able to do by Julie Lythcott-Haims.
Mhm.
And it's included in her book, How to Raise an Adult. And Julie was a former dean of freshmen at Stanford University who wrote this book because she was so shocked by the lack of practical skills that these kids have. So she created this list, and it includes things like, being able to manage their homework on their own, being able to make appointments, being able to get from point A to point B on their own, um, being able to talk to a stranger without a parent's assistance. And I think that training for all of these things starts from day one. You know, it's not something that your kid wakes up on their 18th birthday suddenly knowing how to do. So you do have to start training that independence from a very young age. It can be
Yeah.
challenging for sure, but yeah, you are raising an adult after all. You don't want to raise a child who still needs you at 18. You want that person at that age, as hard as it can be for a parent, because in a way, you're pushing away the thing that you want to keep closest. But that is the natural part of that process of growing that needs to occur.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for elaborating. I know we did touch on it earlier, but I think that that list makes so much sense. And again, I think it's just something that parents overlook. And like you said, like they think kids are automatically going to get this, but they're not. Like unless you give them and create those opportunities for them to get it. And again, maybe a generation ago, this wasn't even something we had to talk about because kids would just automatically get it from being out in the neighborhood. We used to just kick our kids out in the morning and say, go play, come back for dinner. And they had to negotiate, with their friends when it came to play or the kids in the neighborhood. They had to negotiate with maybe adult neighbors that might be interacting with them and possibly disciplining them. I don't know. That was definitely something that we've lost as well. This idea of the village. So these things were really natural. But again, just because of where we are as a society, we almost have to design this for our kids. So
And I
yeah,
think, yeah, a key part of what you sort of mentioned there that we should tie it all together with is that the devices, so the handheld devices, the smartphones, the tablets, video games, a lot of this technology that dominates kids' lives is actually preventing kids from having the time and having the opportunity to be doing a lot of these things. So I think in the past, because we didn't have these, constant distractions, our kids, you and I grew up probably in times before we had smartphones in our pockets. We were more, we had more contact with people and with family members and community members who were encouraging us or expecting us to do these things. And so we learn these skills. So now we have to sort of create these opportunities and get the kids off the devices to learn these skills.
yeah. I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot is resilience. And this was probably, I know we touched on it earlier. This was probably one of the main reasons I delayed as long as I did for my son is I wanted him to be a little bit uncomfortable if I was 5 minutes late. I wanted him to know what to do if he couldn't find me for pickup, right? And sometimes we would talk about it. I would say, hey, if I'm ever running late, like go check with the teacher or go to the office or, if you got lost, like what would you do? Like we'd have these conversations, right? But if you're never in a place where you're uncomfortable or even thinking about what you need to do or looking up, like I wanted him to be looking up in the carpool line, looking for me, not looking down, texting me, right? Like these are just basic things that if you're maybe tuned in and paying attention to the world that you'll maybe get automatically. But it's again, something where we can think about teaching these skills too. And by being tethered to our kids, I think we as parents maybe get a little bit lazy. Like we don't need to make the plan for pickup, right? Because I can just do it at the last minute. And I know it's convenient. But again, these are learning skills that they're not getting, because we're doing it for them and we're allowing them to, or not allowing them, I should say, to be uncomfortable. So I think we kind of come back to that resilience theme again.
And that
Yeah.
is one thing I have to do with my kids because they don't have phones. We sort of have a daily check-in the morning
Yeah.
in the kitchen when they're packing their lunches to go to school, where
Yes.
we just go over the day's schedule, like who has to be where at what time and who's picking up who. And we have to discuss it because I actually don't have a way of reaching them throughout the day. I could call the school. I could,
Yeah.
use the standard procedure that everyone is supposed to use, really, instead of texting their kids. Um, but I don't generally want to do that. I'd rather just talk to them in person and let them know things. So there are times where they're waiting for me or I'm waiting for them. And there's that discomfort of the
Yeah.
unknown, of just not being able to see exactly where they are. But it always works out in the end. They know
Yeah.
how to get a hold of me, and that's what's the most important thing. And I do receive calls and texts from unknown numbers on my phone because they've borrowed someone else's phone to get a hold of
Yeah.
me, and it's always worked out. So,
Totally.
yeah.
I mean, I think we do the daily schedule too for the same reason. And for me, I think that's also teaching them good work skills, like staying organized, looking ahead. Like these are, again, life skills that we're helping them learn where they may be deprived of that otherwise. So um, awesome. Okay. So the last thing I want to ask you about is this idea of risky play. So we talk about play a lot in our work and, why kids need to do it, why they're evolved to do it. But I want to ask you specifically about risky play. So maybe explain to people what that means and why do kids need it?
Well, risky play is there's several different categories of risky play. So it's play that just sort of challenges a child physically and emotionally in ways that just, or more ordinary play might not. It pulls the kid out of their safety zone. It tests the boundaries of their bodies and of their psychological limits. And it's things that kids really want to do. So, I mean, most adults will watch kids play out in the wild when they're actually free, playing outdoors. And you'll sort of be uncomfortable often with the things that they're doing. It challenges our ideas of what we think is fun or what we think is right. But really, what they're doing is they're learning. So the 8 categories of risky play, I don't know if I can remember all of them right now, but playing with fire, playing with sharp objects, playing at heights, playing at high speeds, playing close to places where they could get lost. So maybe on the edge of a forest. Let me see. Also, playing vicariously is another category. So watching older kids. I think I said sharp objects. So I think what's really important is we live in a culture right now that's obsessed with safetyism. We try to make things as safe as possible. And the goal of ultimate safety is seen as the the thing that we want to achieve more than anything. But in the process, we've actually eliminated a lot of opportunities for kids to engage in these categories of risky play, which they need, because this is what builds strength. It's what builds confidence. And so I think that we need to start reinstating this in their lives, which involves us stepping back and maybe not being so quick to say, be careful or don't do that. Instead, just letting the kid determine what they feel that they can do within reason. There are some children who cannot self-regulate, but the vast majority of children are quite adept at determining what they're able to do and what they're not. So for instance, we have a very tall tree in our backyard, and my kids climb way high up in this. It's a pine tree, and it kind of terrifies me, but I've never told them to come down because they are comfortable getting to a certain point. And inevitably, they reach a point where they don't want to go any higher because
Yeah.
they know that they've reached a point where they're not safe anymore. And then they can come down. I gave my kids pocket knives and let them start whittling sticks when they were quite little and showed them the correct way to always keep the blade pointed away from them and, never put anything in front of it. And so they learned how to handle knives within a sort of supervised setting from a young age. We didn't demonize them or vilify them or make them seem like they're really terrifying off limits things. We just said, these are the tools that you need to learn, with fire too, teaching them how to light fires and do it in a safe kind of controlled setting. So I think that we need more of this in kids' lives, and kids respond to it so well. When they can go tobogganing, when they can throw snowballs, when they can, yeah, just run at high speeds, ride their bikes, build jumps for their bikes, for their skateboards. And I have 3 boys, so they're incredibly physical in their play. A lot of girls are too. My experience is only with boys, and it's just absolutely baffling how much energy they have to release over the course of their play. And I think that they really thrive. Well, the evidence shows that kids flourish when they are able to get their energy out in this way. So we do need to reintroduce it. We need to be less concerned about safety and maybe a bit more concerned about whether or not our kids are able to test their bodies and their minds in these ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to trusting our kids, right? Trusting that they know their limits. There might be broken bones here and
Mm-hmm.
there occasionally. I mean, that's part of childhood. We used to have a lot more broken bones. As you were talking, I was thinking about, I don't know if it's like this in Canada, but in the United States, monkey bars have gone away. When new playgrounds come, we get rid of monkey bars because of, broken bones and things like that. And not that I want kids to have broken bones, but making mistakes is part of learning, right? And through risky play, they can do a little bit of that and maybe get hurt a little bit, build resilience, things like that. So it reminded me of that as well when you were talking about kind of society and the changes we're making. But and then the other thing I was thinking of, I don't know if you're familiar with RIE, which is like an early childhood methodology. It was something that I was doing before I was doing it, which is basically it has to do with trusting the baby or the toddler to know their physical limits, right? So, for example, when kids are very little, if they can climb up by themselves, they can likely climb down by themselves. Where if you
Mm-hmm.
help them climb up, that might be dangerous because now they might not be able to get back down. So it's a really interesting methodology, but it reminds me of what we're talking about when you were talking about your sons knowing how far they can go, right? I mean, if we trust our kids, generally they will know their own limits. Now, obviously, temperament factors in. Like you might have very careful kids versus very, kids that want to take huge risks, right? But in general, if we trust them to know their limits, they will and not intervene, right? Whether we're pushing them up or holding them back, they will generally know what they can do. So I don't know if you have anything else to add, but those were the things I was thinking.
Yeah, I would just add too, you're still around. If when you're letting them do their thing, it doesn't mean that you're just neglecting them completely. I
Right.
think you used the term lawnmower parent before. Lifeguard parent is another great one that I've heard, where you sort of just hover on the sidelines of their play and you're there in case of emergency only. And another great rule I often have used in the past was the 17-second rule. This came from Dr. Mariana Brusoni. She's a professor of pediatrics at the University of British Columbia. And she says, in any given situation with kids playing, count to 17 before you intervene, because usually kids can get themselves out of whatever sticky situation they're dealing with within 17 seconds. I don't know why it's 17. It seems such a strange number, but she said it works almost every time. And if they're still stuck, still crying for help, still, seeming really uncomfortable with something, then you get up and you go help them. But yeah, you do need to let them sort out a lot of these problems on their own, and usually they will.
I heard something just to piggyback on that a little bit. Have you ever heard Red, White, and Blue?
No.
Idea. It was from a pediatrician, actually like a friend's pediatrician, but it always stuck with me. And it had to do with sibling rivalry. And he said, unless there's red, white, and blue, so blood, broken bones, or bruising, leave them alone because they will figure it out, and we can get into sibling rivalry. That's a separate thing, but it's the same idea where if we leave them a little bit more longer, trust them, likely, again, back to parental stress, like you won't have to go in and manage their issues or manage their play or whatever. So I feel like the theme keeps coming back to that we are doing too much as
Yep.
parents.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think you'll definitely make your life easier.
Yeah. Well, Katherine, I've taken more of your time than I wanted. Thank you so, so much. I could talk about these issues all day long. And I mean, we already know you and I are in lockstep with a lot of these things. And it's just so nice to hear about these issues. But what you do is I think you bring so much expert support behind these issues, right? Like there's evidence that these things work, and thank you for inspiring other parents and showing other parents that are doing it this way that they're not alone. I really appreciate your work in that regard.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to hear that. It means a lot to know that it's resonating with others.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you.